Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on the programme, with talks in Cairo reported to be making progress, there's growing optimism that Israel and Hamas could be on the brink of agreeing on a ceasefire deal. Ahead of Donald Trump's inauguration next month, we'll be speaking to the US President-elect's pick for counterterrorism chief, Seb Gorka, about how the incoming administration will manage global and domestic threats. In its annual report, the International Rescue Committee says that Sudan is the biggest humanitarian crisis ever recorded. We'll be speaking to the CEO and President of the IRC, David Miliband. And with his inauguration looming, we'll be discussing President-elect Donald Trump's chances of bringing about that swift end to the war in Ukraine that he pledged throughout his campaign. Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin in Gaza, where optimism over a possible ceasefire with Israel is at an all-time high since the start of the war in October of last year. Well, Hamas officials are also saying that reaching an agreement is, quote, possible. This as the US joins forces with regional mediators Egypt and Qatar to advance those talks. Well, while previous attempts at a ceasefire have not delivered lasting results, there is significant momentum and a flurry of diplomatic activity right now, and that's raising hopes of the prospect. Well, Donald Trump, who will become the US president next month, has issued a stern warning calling for the release of all remaining hostages still being held in Gaza by the time of his inauguration in January.
On Bibi, we had a very good talk. We discussed what is going to happen, and I'll be very available on January 20th, and we'll see. As you know, I gave warning that if these hostages aren't back home by that date, all hell's going to break out, and very strong. But we generally just discussed, I asked him, where are things? Mike Waltz they're doing a great job, by the way. Everybody is very happy. I think he's doing a fantastic job. But he was very much involved in the call. But it was a recap call more than anything else.
President-elect Donald Trump speaking there. Well, even as the talks progress, Israeli strikes continue in parts of Gaza. Well, the latest strikes today alone have claimed 16 Palestinian lives, pushing the death toll above the 45,000 mark there in Gaza since the war broke out on the 7th of October of last year. Well, to get more on the ceasefire talks and the possible impact on Israel, Gaza and the region, we're joined by the former secretary of the Israeli delegation for the Camp David negotiations, Gidi Grinstein. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. It sounds, doesn't it, like those talks in Cairo are making some progress. Could the 14-month-old war in Gaza be about to pause or even end?
Thank you very much for having me. It does seem that we're getting closer and closer to a very significant deal. It's not a deal that ends the war, but it is a deal that shrinks the conflict, perhaps gets a ceasefire. There are a few outstanding issues here that have to be addressed, that still have to be resolved, First is the prisoners versus the hostages, right? The Palestinian side wants more prisoners and what we call heavyweights, meaning people that have been convicted of murders or mass murders, etc. And in this case, obviously, the issue is how many of them will be released and whether those heavyweights will be exiled. And if they're exiled, where are they going to be exiled to? On the receiving end, on the Israeli side, the issue is how many hostages are going to be released right now. There is a perception in Israel that the hostages that remain behind may not survive the winter, meaning another long term in the Hamas tunnels in Gaza. So there is a pressure in Israel to bring as many of them as possible home right now. We also have to remember the context. There is a very important Jewish holiday coming up next week. And then there is obviously the Christian holidays and the end of the year. So there is that kind of time pressure to bring the deal together. The other thing that I believe is very central in the negotiations is the whole mechanism of reaching a ceasefire and eventually transitioning into the day after and the long-term situation, what we call the political horizon in Gaza. Because one of Hamas' demands is that Israel will withdraw from Gaza altogether. Israel is saying, we're not letting go of the security perimeter and other key security issues in Gaza, we cannot be exposed again to an attack by Hamas, which brings us to the third issue, and that is the political transition in Gaza, because Israel rejects any notion of continued Hamas control of Gaza. In this case, Israel itself is not clear about what it wants, because Israel ruled out Hamas. It also ruled out Fatah, which is the other major leading Palestinian party. It also ruled out the Palestinian Authority. So effectively, Israel has not come forward with any mechanism for governing Gaza post-Hamas, which is part of the void that has been created in Gaza, which is why it's easier for Hamas to stay in power in that kind of situation. So I believe that all of these things together are now being discussed, and hopefully it looks like we're moving towards some sort of a deal in the next few days, I hope, hopefully within a week.
Okay, so clearly some sticking points remain, none of them particularly new.
Here are sticking points.
Yeah, as you say. And Hamas wants any immediate deal to pave the way for a comprehensive deal. So this is kind of the deal before the big deal, if I've understood correctly. And I'm just wondering what you think the focus would be between this immediate deal and the more comprehensive deal.
So right now, I believe that there will be some sort of a ceasefire for a few weeks, within which there'll be a talk about the next phase. I believe that the next phase is quite clear. What we have today in the West Bank is a division of the West Bank into three types of areas. Area A, which is fully controlled by the Palestinians. Area B, where Israel has security control and Palestinians have civilian control. Altogether, 40% of the West Bank. And then you have Area C, about 60% of the West Bank, where Israel has security and civilian control. The solution for Gaza, I believe inevitable, is to divide Gaza into Area A and Area B, meaning there will be some areas that will be controlled by the Palestinians and other areas, about 20% of Gaza, that will remain Area B, meaning under Israeli security control for a transition period of a few years. Probably it makes sense to speak about 4 years, which is the term of President Trump. So once you have Area A and B in Gaza, the significance is that according to the Oslo Accords, Area A and B will be Palestinian in permanent status, meaning once you divide the area of Gaza into these categories, you're actually saying that in the long term, all of Gaza will be Palestinian. There'll be full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza when the conditions are right. Also, it allows the Palestinian Authority or the PLO to invite the international force, Arab-led, with American participation or without American participation, with UAE leadership, Saudi leadership, whatever it is. Then once you define that 80% of Gaza, for example, is Area A, meaning it's Palestinian, you are unlocking the mechanism that allows to bring in the international force and the security forces of the Palestinians that can begin to fill the vacuum in Gaza and replace Hamas. Another thing we have to remember here is that effectively in Gaza right now there is a legal void. Once Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, it took with it the legal system that was attached to its presence there. When Hamas came into power, it canceled the existing agreement. Hamas is no longer in power, so there is a void in Gaza. So we have to reignite the Gazan legal system and the Gazan economic system in the day after the war. So obviously, all these questions that I'm sharing with your viewership right now, they're not being negotiated right now. But this is the day after in the negotiations. The moment there is a deal and there is a ceasefire and we're beginning to talk about what's next, these issues are going to be very prominent.
Yeah, I mean, for people who are listening and saying, we've kind of been here before, haven't we? Why is there more optimism now than there would be than there had been in previous occasions when, in fact, there turned out to be no deal at all? I'm just wondering whether you think perhaps there are some answers to that question. I mean, obviously, President Biden has only got a month left in office, and that's added some sense of US momentum. And Hamas has been degraded to such an extent that they're weakened and maybe their negotiating positions have softened somewhat. Do you agree with either of those assessments?
Yes, I think, Tom, I think you captured most of it, at least on the Arab side and also on the American side. Let's start with the American side. You put a segment President Trump. President Trump is bringing some sort of a new energy to multiple arenas around the world. He's very adamant about his policies coming in. He's very assertive about what he wants before coming into office. And that creates a lot of energy. Also, I have to commend the way in which the Biden administration is working with the Trump administration on these issues, meaning the Biden people are still in power and they are leading. But they're, I believe, closely coordinated with the Trump people. And I think this is really very important for the process. Second, you spoke about Hamas. Hamas, for a long time, since October 7, was hoping for what they call the unification of the fronts, meaning Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iran, everything coming together. Meanwhile, more than a year later, Hezbollah is beat up. Iran has suffered a significant setback. Assad is no longer there. The Houthis have been hit. So Hamas is alone. Hamas calculations, strategic calculations, have been compromised. So in many ways, their hands are, their hand is weaker. Plus, there's a lot of reports about very significant popular uproar and anger at Hamas in Gaza. There was just a story I read yesterday that a very senior representative of Hamas in Cairo, was badly beat up by Gazans who he accidentally met in the mall. There's a lot of anger from Gazan population against Hamas. The third thing is Israel. You're looking at a prime minister who now has a wider coalition, which means that he's less accountable. He's less held by the far-right factions of his government, and he feels the ability to move forward, more flexibility to move forward. The other thing is in Israel is that there is pressure from the military that right now is saying to the prime minister, our mission in Gaza is not clear. The war has basically ended. Our forces are standing there. We are sitting targets. We're doing incursions here and there. But what is the goal of the war in Gaza? And many Israelis are asking that. So there is a bottom-up pressure in Israel to get the deal. Let me just mention, for those of you who are not following what's going on in Israel, the pressure of the hostage families on the government is immense. Every day there are demonstrations by thousands of people sometimes just to demand the release of the hostages. So there's pressure bubbling up in Israel. The Hamas hand is weaker. Americans are moving much more decisively toward the deal. I think the Americans always wanted the deal, but now they're very decisive. So all of these things are getting us closer and closer to a position. Last, I'll say that I think there's also a change in the positions in the negotiation of both Hamas and Israel. Israel is willing to do more. Hamas is demanding a little less, so we're closer.
Yeah, well, Hamas is saying a deal is possible if Israel stops setting new conditions. Is there any truth to that, do you think?
I think that in international negotiations, a lot of times you work from principles to details. So we agree on a general principle, let's say a prisoner exchange, and then we begin to exchanging prisoners for hostages. And then we begin to talk about the details, and the details bring up more issues. So every side, one side or the other side, can say these are new demands. But in fact, it's part of the dynamics of going from principles to details. I believe that also on the Palestinian side, there have been differing demands. Obviously, Hamas now is on its back foot, so its ability to actually make these demands from Israel is weaker. But still, in the past, we saw Hamas changing their positions, wanting different prisoners released from the Israeli jails, et cetera, et cetera. So right now, I believe that the pressure is moving toward a deal. And the Qataris are leaning in, the Egyptians are leaning in, the Americans are in, Israel and Hamas are closer in their positions. So I think a lot of Israelis, present company included, are hopeful that there will be a deal.
Indeed, and it seems to be a case of the Biden administration wanting something to be able to report with regards to the legacy of President Biden, and certainly the incoming administration wanting to make a mark as well. And with that in mind, you talk about the cooperation between these two administrations, and an example of it is the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu meeting this week Adam Boehler, who is Donald Trump's special envoy for hostage affairs. I mean, I just wonder what sort of a difference of approach you think this new administration is going to bring?
first of all, the new administration will have a lot of catching up to do in terms of the details. Managing these negotiations is an extremely intricate business, and it requires a lot of knowledge. Even when you look at the Biden team, the expertise, the core expertise of the Biden team was not on the Palestinian issue. It was more focused on, Syria, ISIS, etc. These were perceived as the main challenges that faced concerns of America. The Palestinian issue was seen as a dormant issue, a very benign conflict, not too many casualties. I'm talking prior to October 7th. And then it takes time to catch up. So I think, first of all, we have to be modest about the ability of the Trump team, the new Trump team, the newly appointed Trump team, to make kind of nuanced and targeted interventions. I do want to mention that there is a very veteran team around Trump, which was led by Jared Kushner, who's involved, but he's not involved in these issues. I believe, by the way, that Jared Kushner will be involved in kind of the diplomatic architecture that will come out in the Middle East following the war. Probably is already doing it right now. And in terms of change of policy, I think that what Trump has that Biden does not have is Trump published a peace plan. And I invite your viewership to review it. January 2020, it's a very substantive and serious plan. The Palestinians rejected it out of hand, which I think was a very big mistake. What the Palestinians should have done was to mark it up. But this plan actually offers a vision for a two-state solution. And the precondition for discussing this plan is the removal of Hamas. Now, 4 years ago, or 5 years ago, it was seen as a fantastic demand that's never going to happen. But right now, we're moving in the direction of Hamas no longer being in power, which means that Trump actually has a political platform to work with, which speaks about the principle, as I said, of two nation states for two people, expanding Gaza in order to allow its development, the connection. Gaza and the West Bank is a single territorial unit, which has been a fundamental principle of Israeli-Palestinian political process since the 1990s, and Palestinian state, a vision for a Palestinian state in the West Bank. All of these things are in the Trump plan. So I think that there could be a moment where Trump is basically saying to everybody, look, I have this plan, which I published in January 2020. I want everybody to look at it. And that could be the basis for the political process, what we call toward the political horizon that everybody's talking about.
Okay, well, we'll have to see. Well, thank you very much. We're out of time. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Gidi.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Turning our attention now to the United States, where there's just over 1 month to go until the inauguration of President-elect Donald Trump. Well, a subject of considerable discussion on both sides of the aisle there in the US has been the cabinet appointments that will be central to the incoming Trump administration. Well, amongst the picks, Seb Gorka, the president-elect's nomination for Director of Counterterrorism, who served briefly in the first Trump administration. He'll be taking up that new role at a time of uncertainty in several areas of the world, including in the Middle East and in Ukraine, and at a time when some say the US is more divided than ever before. Well, Dr. Gorka joins us now from Washington. Thank you so much for speaking to us. You've been nominated, as I said, as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Counterterrorism. Congratulations on that. Just tell us, how did this appointment come about? Did Mr. Trump call you himself?
Well, let me just first say that it's not quite cabinet level. Thank you kindly. Usually that's for secretaries. But yes, I will be in the White House running counterterrorism for the president and for the incoming National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz. How did it come about? About a year and a half before the election, I traveled to Mar-a-Lago to talk to President Trump about what I could do to support him and the America First agenda, should we be so lucky to have him reelected. And then, yes, about half an hour before the announcement was officially made, he called me from Mar-a-Lago and he said, Sebastian, get ready. It's about to become official.
Okay, so it didn't come as a complete surprise, I take it.
No, not completely. Not completely. He said he wanted me back for a second administration in that term. And then about a week or 10 days before the nomination was actually official, there was a gathering at Mar-a-Lago where he saw me in the crowd And he said in front of a few hundred people, we're going to give Seb a very special job. And somebody recorded it on the ubiquitous cell phone and uploaded it onto social media. So it wasn't quite as much of a surprise as even I had expected.
Okay, well, you are indeed, as we've been saying, taking up that senior role, Director for Counterterrorism. Just wondering what you're going to bring to the role.
About 30 years of doing this. So I've spent my career in national security studying the ideology and the strategy of global jihadist groups such as Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, Hezbollah, Hamas. I've trained the US military, law enforcement, the intelligence community. So now it's going beyond the theory and the training aspect to the actual policy coordination for the US government in counterterrorism.
Just to be clear, I mean, on a formality, this is a role that doesn't require Senate confirmation, does it? So there are no hoops for you to jump through, so to speak.
Well, only the internal ones. Everybody who works for the president has to be vetted both politically and in terms of security clearance. I have maintained my top secret security clearance since I left government, so that's even less of a hurdle for me. But no, everyone who works inside the White House, who works inside the National Security Council as a political appointee of the president does not require Senate confirmation.
Okay, we've been talking a lot on this channel, Al Arabiya News, about the new lineup in the Trump administration, who's in, who's not in. Just wondering what your thoughts are as to when you look at that lineup, what's going to be achieved when Donald Trump gets back to the White House?
Everything will be achieved that is required to make all Americans prosperous and safe, whether or not they voted for President Trump, whether or not they're amongst the 77 million who said, yes, after the disastrous Biden-Harris 4 years, we want President Trump back. If you look at the picks, they're all people who have proven themselves, people who know each other. I mean, it's not a secret. You know, I'm friends with Kash Patel, the incoming director of the FBI. Likewise, Tom Homan, the real border czar who is coming in to work for President Trump to replace that disaster who was Kamala Harris as putative border czar. So this is a group of people who understand President Trump, understand the mandate of 77 million votes, popular and electoral college. And these are people who are committed to one thing and the one thing above all else: America first and making America great again. That's the big difference, on top of the fact that we will not permit seditionist, traitorous individuals into the building, like former Chief of Staff John Kelly, like Colonel Vindman, who actually committed felonies by leaking classified information to the mainstream media to undermine and sabotage the president. That will not be happening in the second Trump administration.
What do you think are going to be your top priorities, your top concerns as you take up that position? And I'm talking here specifically with regards to counterterrorism efforts.
Well, you can split the terrorist threat into two very obvious baskets: the intrinsic, the internal, and the extrinsic, the external. So what we have inside America, continental United States, is an unbelievably heightened terrorist threat thanks to the feckless lack of leadership of the Biden-Harris administration. They literally dismantled our border, made sure we had no national sovereignty. As a result, the official Biden figures are that 8 million illegals were allowed into the country in the last 4 years. If you add to those the gotaways, people who were not in contact with the authorities as they crossed the border, you can double it to about 16 million at least. If only 1% of that 16 million are malefactors, are cartel members, foreign agents, terrorists, then we are talking about divisional-sized assets. So the primary concern for Kash Patel, for Governor Noem, Secretary of Homeland Security, for Tom Homan as the border czar, is to identify the most dangerous terrorist threats who are inside America already, thanks to Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, and to neutralize them and to get them out of America. The external threat, sadly, is very simply the recrudescence of global jihadism. We saw what happened in October the 7th with the slaughter of the innocents in Israel. And now we see the collapse of Syria provide new opportunities for the global jihadi movement, even if they've tried to relabel themselves as moderates. Global jihadism is on the rise. Thanks to Joe Biden's lack of leadership, that will be our two primary baskets of terrorist threats.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you about events in Syria. Obviously, Bashar al-Assad is out after his family ruled the country for 54 years. HTS is in. Do you think the United States should reconsider that group's designation as a terrorist organization?
I'm not going to steal the thunder of my past and future boss, President Trump, nor Colonel Mike Waltz, the incoming National Security Advisor, or the Secretary of State. Foreign terrorist designations are done through the State Department. So, Senator Rubio will be heavily involved in any FTO designations. But let me tell you, as somebody who's studied jihadis for about 30 years, there has never, ever been a case since the establishment of the Ikhwan after Mustafa Kemal Ataturk dissolved the original caliphate after World War I. There has never been a modern jihadi leader who suddenly became a moderate after decapitating Christians and Jews and apostate Muslims or burning Jordanian fighter pilots alive in cages. None of these leaders said, "Oh no, I love Jews and Christians" the next day, or apostate Muslims who disagree with us, they're fine. Never happened in history. So let me just leave it at that. The idea that, a jihadi leader who was a part of ISIS slightly trims his beard and says, "I'm a good guy now," hasn't happened in the last 100 years of the modern global jihadi movement.
Indeed, but not all of that can be applied to Ahmed al-Shara, or also known as Mohammed al-Julani, who promises to be representative and inclusive in.
Why can't it be applied to him?
You don't believe what he's been saying and the overtures he's been making?
People don't lie. Brutal jihadis don't lie. Is that what you're telling me? Or are you telling me you're looking into his soul and you know whether he's telling the truth or not?
I'm not saying I'm looking into his soul. I'm asking whether you believe him when he says he's going to form an inclusive leadership there in Damascus.
Well, I think I answered the question, didn't I? In the last 100 years of the modern global jihadi movement, from the Ikhwan to Al-Qaeda to Daesh, there has never been a jihadi leader who became a moderate just because he said so. So draw your requisite conclusions.
So the UN envoy has been in Damascus this week. Various European diplomats have been in Damascus this week. Some flags have been hoisted above embassies in Damascus this week. Do you think it's not better that there should be dialogue with this new leadership in Damascus than no dialogue at all?
You're kind of going around in circles, or I'm not sure you're listening to what I said. In the history, the 100-year history of the modern jihadi movement, since the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood, there has never been a prominent jihadi leader who became a moderate. Never happened. So that's my take on what we're witnessing in Syria. And I don't speak for other US nations. I don't even speak for America. I'm a private citizen until 12:01 on January the 20th. And I'm not speaking for President Trump either. But the idea that the United Nations did something, you mean the organization that is predominantly famous for having its blue helmets rape children in Africa? Let me just say, I'm really not interested in what the United Nations may or may not be doing right now in terms of jihadism, because they don't have a very preeminent track record in that domain.
So your assessment of Syria's future, I mean, from what I'm hearing, doesn't sound very optimistic.
Well, it's completely fluid. It's an utterly plastic situation right now. I mean, God bless Israel for what they've done to secure their country after the biggest loss of Jewish life since the end of the show, at the end of the Holocaust in 1945. There are numerous actors in the region, whether it's the Kurds in the north, whether it's the Druze in the south, whether it's the Arab militias who are anti-jihadi. These are all actors involved in that region right now. If anybody tells you they know what the future of that benighted country is, they're lying to you. So I have one request for Christmas. I would like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Jake Sullivan not to do anything in the region, because they've created enough chaos and carnage in the last 4 years, and wait until the adults who actually know what they're doing are back in control at 12:01 on January the 20th.
Okay, so in your capacity as a private citizen, could I ask for your opinion? The $10 million bounty on the head of al-Julani, should that be removed?
Not appropriate for me to comment, given my incoming position.
Okay. You mentioned your strong support for Israel. There are reports coming out of Cairo, quite promising sounding reports, that a ceasefire deal could be fairly imminent with regards to the continuing war in Gaza. I just wonder what you make of those reports.
What I said when I saw the unedited 47-minute video of what the jihadists of Hamas did on October the 7th. I want Israel to kill everybody responsible for the rape and murder of women and children and the killing of unarmed men on that day. We are in a civilizational war between decency and barbarity. On the one side, Judeo-Christian civilization and our Muslim allies and partners in the Middle East. And on the other side, those who believe that decapitating innocent journalists live on camera like Daniel Pearl because they're American and Jewish is okay. I am wearing a bracelet from the families of the hostages I met a week ago, some of whom are American citizens. And it says, bring them all home now. This is an absolute outrage that we are, a year and a half away from that atrocity, and we still have those in captivity, Jewish and American, who are being used as bargaining chips by individuals who have an ideology that negates the right of existence for a whole civilization and whole nations. That's where I stand. I stand with decency against barbarity.
And what would you say would be the best way to go about getting those remaining hostages home?
It's exactly what President Trump said, and it is what the families of those hostages told me. They have had more than 100 visits with the Biden administration since October the 7th, more than 100, to no avail. And they said to us, they said to me, the one social media post from President Trump a week and a half ago, where he said that if the hostages are not released by the time of his inauguration as the President of the United States for a second term, and in capital letters he wrote, there will be all hell to pay. That is a promise President Trump will keep.
We're coming to the end, but I just want to ask you, I mean, it's after 7 months, I think it was, in the first Trump administration, you resigned. You said that forces, quote unquote, in opposition to Trump's policies had forced you out. I'm wondering whether you think those same forces are going to be present in the second Trump administration.
I think I addressed that about 12 minutes ago. I said one of the biggest difference between now and then is that we will not allow subversive saboteurs into the building, such as John Kelly or Colonel Vinderman, who did everything they could to undermine the mission of President Trump to represent the will of 64 million Americans back then. Now it's going to be 77 million Americans who gave him a mandate. So no, one of the biggest differences is we will not have traitorous individuals like General Kelly or Colonel Vinmer inside the building undermining the writ of the American people.
Just lastly, you didn't mention John Bolton there, and I'm sure you've read...
Oh, John Bolton's not worth my time. He's a clown. He's an utter clown who goes on CNN. Well, what self-respecting Republican goes on CNN to bash his former boss? He's a sad little man with a laughable clown's mustache, so don't give him any oxygen, because I'm not going to.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us, Dr. Sebastian Gorka. Thank you.
God bless. Thank you.
Now, according to the International Rescue Committee, there are currently 305 million people around the world who are in need of humanitarian support. Well, in their 2025 annual emergency watch list, the IRC has listed Sudan as being the biggest humanitarian crisis ever recorded, accounting for 10% of all the people in humanitarian need globally. That is despite the fact that the country is home to just 1% of the global population. Well, for the first time in several years, Syria has now re-entered the top 5 countries of concern. Well, let's get more on this now, and we can speak to David Miliband, the CEO and President of the International Rescue Committee and the former British Foreign Secretary. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, Mr. Miliband. The International Rescue Committee, of course, responds to the world's worst humanitarian crises. You've just published this IRC annual emergency watch list. For the benefit of people who don't know, just tell us, what does this watch list reveal?
The International Rescue Committee is a humanitarian charity working to combat the consequences of war and disaster around the world. And each December, we do a statistical analysis of about 70 to 80 indicators, quantitative and qualitative, to rank the 20 biggest looming humanitarian catastrophes, the countries in which there are the greatest number of people in humanitarian need. In total around the world today, it's about 305 million people who depend on non-governmental organizations, charities, to survive. 3 of the top 6 are in the Middle East region, in Gaza and the West Bank, the occupied Palestinian territories, in Syria and in Lebanon. But top of the list is Sudan, which has 30 million people in humanitarian need. So the watch list is both an internal planning tool to help us gear up for the year ahead, but it's also a call to action to the wider world to recognize the needs that must be addressed.
Yeah, we're going to talk in more detail as the interview goes on about some of the specific countries in the top 5 in the rankings. But just going to that overall figure that you just articulated there, 305 million people in humanitarian need. I mean, that's up 4-fold on a decade. It was about 78 million in 2015. I mean, it really looks, doesn't it, like you're fighting a losing battle. We're all fighting a losing battle here.
Well, that's a very good point. Certainly, the fact that there are now 59 conflicts going on around the world, that there are 42 non-state actors who are in control, de facto authorities. These are part of the syndrome that's seen this remarkable rise in humanitarian need. Now, it's also the case that this isn't just conflict that's driving humanitarian need, although that is the primary driver. There's also the climate crisis, which is exposing the most vulnerable parts of the world to extra danger. And in the last 2 or 3 years, there have been the consequences of higher interest rates and the economic drag anchor of a tougher economic climate. But these are all man-made. These aren't acts of fate. And the purpose of our watch list is to say that just as these have been created by human decisions, so the suffering of the civilians can be mitigated. I think it's important for your viewers to have in mind that more than 8 out of 10, 82% of the total number of people in humanitarian need are concentrated in just these 20 countries. Overall around the world, and you've seen this in the Middle East region, poverty levels are actually going down in stable states, but they're rising in conflict-affected, fragile states. Over the last 20 years, since the early 2000s, extreme poverty in stable countries has gone down by 30 to 40%. But in unstable, war-torn countries, it's gone up. And Syria would be a very good example. It's gone up. Sudan is obviously the prime example. It's gone up by nearly 90%.
I wanted to ask you about Syria. Of course, it's often called, well, it had been called one of the world's forgotten crises. And that's indeed a term that was used by the IRC to describe the situation there. It's been on your watch list for several years. And I'm just wondering now, with developments these last 2 weeks, with the toppling of Bashar al-Assad, what you think that's going to mean for this crisis?
Well, that's a very good point that you make, that we never took Syria off our watch list. We said it had been forgotten by others, but not forgotten by us. We had teams working in the northwest of Syria and in the northeast of Syria, in the rebel-held areas. And across Syria as a whole, 16 million people out of a remaining population of maybe 17, 18 million, almost the whole, very large swathe of the population were in humanitarian need. Of course, the total population of Syria at the beginning of the civil war was about 25 million, but 6 million refugees have left the country to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, also Germany. UK has taken some. And so Syria was, as far as we're concerned, those who said the war was over, that President Assad had won, that felt to us like something that was detached from reality. Now, the situation today is that Syria well merits its place on our watch list with the 16 million people in humanitarian need. But if things go right, it shouldn't be on the watch list in a year's time. The trouble is we don't know. Obviously, there's a lot up for grabs. The new governing authorities are beginning to turn words into action. There's been some words about how Syria must be for all Syrians. Of course, Syria has a complex, diverse denominational population demographics. And the words have been about an inclusive government, an inclusive political settlement. That's obviously significant. Some refugees are coming back to Syria. The UN High Commission on Refugees says that up to 1 million will return in the first 6 months. But we also know that some minority groups are leaving. So it well merits its place on our watch list, but there is hope that in a year's time it won't be there.
And obviously, as we've been saying, a very fast evolving situation there, and really difficult to sort of make sense at this very early stage of what things are going to look like in a year from now. But in terms of the priorities for the IRC, what are you identifying as being the immediate things that need to be considered for helping the situation there?
You're talking about Syria, are you?
Syria, absolutely.
Yeah. And the most important priorities are, one, to make sure that there is an inclusive governing system. We worked in the northwest of Syria, where the armed opposition groups who are now in control of the whole country were in control before, and they let us get on with our business. We worked with the civil authorities to deliver humanitarian aid. We weren't told who to give aid to. We weren't told who to not to give aid to. Our funds were not interfered with. So that's very important. Secondly, it's vital that the health system of Syria, which in some ways has been significantly reduced, is sustained. Thirdly, there's a threat of hyperinflation, that the economic sustenance of the country is very, very important indeed. Obviously, that in part depends on engagement with the wider world. And obviously, from a humanitarian point of view, we want the border crossing points that were closed to humanitarian aid by President Assad to be opened up. So there are some immediate priorities that are really pressing.
And of course, there are some 7 million Syrian refugees living outside Syria, and some European countries are talking about suspending decisions on asylum claims by Syrian nationals. How concerned are you about what happens to them?
Well, obviously, Turkey's got 3 million refugees. They've talked very clearly about them going back. Lebanon, 1 million. Jordan, 500,000 to 1 million. And it's in everyone's interest that people are able to go back. Our stress is always that the returns need to be voluntary and they need to be safe. So European countries are saying, look, we don't know, we can't do an asylum adjudication at this point because it's impossible to say whether or not it's going to be safe for people to go back. We know that 2 weeks ago, people didn't feel safe to go back. They thought their sons and husbands would be brought into the army or worse. Now there's uncertainty. So you can understand that for a short period, there is stasis, there is an inability to make an asylum determination. But I think that the clear aim should be that Syria is safe enough for Syrians to go back.
Yeah, Gaza is also very high up the list of concerns for the IRC. And I'm just wondering how difficult it's been, given what's been happening there, to ensure that aid gets to those who need it the most.
Well, the situation in Gaza has been very, very difficult indeed. Gaza and the West Bank come out at number 2 on our watch list. Sudan, number 1, as I said earlier. Gaza is an extremely concentrated humanitarian catastrophe, to quote the UN Secretary General. And it affects 2 million people, 2 million Palestinians, as well as the 100 hostages who are still left in captivity. Though the needs of those people are absolutely enormous. We've been working on emergency medical work. We've been doing food and nutrition, water and sanitation. We've been trying to look after kids. But as the war goes on, the needs have just been absolutely astronomical. And of course, the health system has been all but destroyed in the course of the fighting. We've been clear that while we will ask our teams to carry on doing their work, these are local people who are hired within Gaza to do their work, the only sustainable way to protect civilians, to deliver aid, to protect aid workers, to release the hostages is to have a ceasefire. That's a political decision, not a humanitarian one, but we can make a humanitarian recommendation. and we've been arguing for a ceasefire for a very long time now as the only way to fulfill the humanitarian imperative. There have been some stories over the weekend that both sides, Hamas and Israel, are inching closer to an agreement to stop the fighting. Obviously, the sooner that happens, the better.
Indeed, and we've been getting reports of progress on that front. So, of course, we'll keep a close eye on developments. I wanted to ask you about Sudan. You mentioned it right at the beginning. Sudan, the biggest crisis now, and I understand the biggest humanitarian crisis in history. And I'm just wondering, why do we hear so little about it, and what can be done to change that?
Well, it's a very good question. I think we hear so little about Sudan because there's so much else going on. Some of what else is going on is significant, whether it be in respect of Syria or whether it be in respect of the global economy. Some of what else is going on is, frankly, superficial and gets probably too much time. But I think Sudan has been squeezed. The Sudan catastrophe has been squeezed. I mean, in 2003-04, when there were massacres in Darfur, it was a major global story. In late 1980s, the Sudan crisis was a major global story. The people of Sudan deserve to have their attention of the world on their situation, because 10% of the total number of people in humanitarian need in the world are in Sudan. A small number, maybe 1 million refugees, small by comparison to 30 million. 1 million refugees have gone into Chad. About 500,000, 600,000 have gone to South Sudan. Those are both poor countries. And so the strain and the stress on the people of Sudan is absolutely huge, as well as on the neighboring states. And our call has been not just on the parties to the conflict, the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Force, to allow humanitarian aid to flow, which both of them have been blocking it, but also on the states that are supporting each side to stop. Because at the moment, both sides think they can win. They seem to have an endless supply of arms. And that is creating now an 18-month humanitarian disaster that threatens to become much longer. And Sudan has been top of our watch list twice. It's the largest humanitarian catastrophe in world history, as you point out. And there's very little hope at the moment that it's going to get better.
I mean, when we look at a report like the one that the IRC has just published, I mean, there seems to be an awful lot of very bleak and very depressing news contained in there. And of course, it's extremely important information. But when you're trying to get donors on board, maintain morale within the organization, it's important, I'd imagine, as well, to have some uplifting findings, some uplifting stories. Has there been anything in the last year that stood out for you as being something that perhaps has given morale a little bit of a boost and said to you, this is all worth it?
Yes, there are many things, but as you've read the report, so you know that as well as the litany of suffering, we're very clear at the end of the report, we have 6 clear sets of recommendations about how aid can be better delivered, and the aid system can be reformed, how civilians can get access to aid, how civilian suffering can be eased by investing in anticipatory action because of climate crisis, how the economy needs to better support the most vulnerable people in the world in fragile and conflict states. So there's a clear agenda for action in our report, not just an agenda for disaster planning. And we are always clear that as a solutions-oriented NGO, our recommendations for what to do come from our clear evidence of what works. So over the last year, we've seen compelling evidence of our immunization drive in East Africa, of our water and sanitation work in Gaza, of our early child development work in the Middle East as well, of our anticipatory action for climate disaster in northern Nigeria. There is no excuse that we don't know what to do. We actually do know what to do. The question is whether or not it can get the funding to support it. And this is not just funding from Western countries. It remains the case that more than 80% of the world's humanitarian funding comes from Western countries. But Western countries don't represent more than 80% of humanitarian need in the world. We all need to share this burden much more fairly. Your own region, the Middle East, is now very wealthy in some ways. And those with power and responsibility and wealth, I hope, will in 2025 take a New Year's resolution to direct their wealth and power to some of the world's most vulnerable people.
Yeah, and of course we're going to have a fairly significant change in Washington in a month or so from now. I'm just wondering whether you're optimistic and what your outlook is for the year ahead with a change of administration at the helm of the most powerful country in the world.
Well, I'm an optimistic person, so I have a optimistic mindset. Obviously, we wait to see what President Trump does, because it's very important that while politics is about tweets and arguments and debates, I used to be in politics, when it comes to people's lives in humanitarian field, we have to be more cautious. We don't respond in a knee-jerk fashion to what's said. I think that it's very important to recognize that the global engagement of countries like the United States can be for good or can be for ill. And it's very important that we make the case for how it can be for good. President Trump has obviously made some very clear statements about how he wants to focus on the home front. But as you say, the decisions in the US have global resonance, they have global implications, and there are requirements of global leadership that I think are very important.
Okay, well, we're out of time. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us, though. David Miliband, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Now, President-elect Donald Trump has repeatedly stated that ending the war in Ukraine is his top priority. He wants to do so quickly, within 24 hours of taking office, to be precise. We're already seeing elements of that plan becoming a reality, with Trump's Ukraine envoy, Keith Kellogg, planning a trip to Kyiv in January. That's according to two anonymous sources, and it's apparently going to happen shortly after New Year's Day. Well, Kellogg will travel to several other capitals, including Paris and Rome, but not to Moscow. Well, during his meetings, he is expected to focus on fact-finding rather than active negotiations. Well, in the past, Donald Trump and his allies have advocated multiple plans to wind down the Ukraine war, most of which would involve Ukraine ceding large areas of its territory to Russia. Well, for more, we can speak now to Jim Townsend, former Deputy Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO under President Barack Obama. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. We've been promised this swift end to the war in Ukraine. How likely is that to happen?
Well, it won't be 24 hours, that's for sure. But it is interesting how fast the Trump team is moving out. There's still a U.S. president. It's Joe Biden, but you would think that Trump's team has already taken power, given the numbers of meetings that they've had. Even a couple of weeks ago, Macron and Zelensky met with Trump. There was a Ukraine team also that traveled to Washington and met with Kellogg and with Vice President-elect J.D. Vance. So this has been going on, and the good news is that this is some fact-finding. Facts are a good thing, and I'm glad this administration is focused on that.
Okay, so some fact-finding rather than any specific goal. Just tell us a bit more about retired General Keith Kellogg. He's 80 years old. Just wondering what you think he brings to the table.
Well, you're right about his age. I think that certainly gives us all pause. To embark on a negotiating trip, even a fact-finding trip, but if it becomes negotiations later on, that takes a lot of stamina. So we'll have to see what kind of role he plays there. But I think what Keith Kellogg brings is some understanding on how things actually work in terms of negotiations with other nations. And he probably has an understanding of Europe as well. If he was in the Army and he's 80 years old, and he's had some Cold War time, probably based in Germany or something along those lines. So he has a feel for processes and structure. Now, that doesn't mean Trump likes process and structure. He doesn't even know what it is, but he knows that he doesn't like it. So Kellogg has a tough time trying to marry up what he knows works when you talk to other nations, when you try to negotiate something as tricky as Ukraine, security guarantees, that type of thing. So he's got to translate that into something that Trump will accept and will understand. And that's tough. But he's bringing this background that enables him to certainly grasp the nuance of how difficult these negotiations will be.
Yeah, one of the things he said that sound pretty striking was the fact that he is prepared to go to Moscow to have meetings there if invited. I mean, were General Kellogg to go to Moscow, that would be a pretty extraordinary step, wouldn't it, for a US official, given that sanctions are in place and given the state of relations between Moscow and Washington.
And also given the fact that the Trump administration isn't in power yet. So Keith Kellogg could certainly, I guess he could get some type of waivers to go to Moscow. He could meet with Putin's people there. But I think I think that's an extreme step. I think that's a foolish step until he does gather the facts. And I think what's really important in all of this, though, is that he's going to go to European capitals. I was concerned that he and the Trump administration would try to do something on their own with Putin, that it would be negotiated over the heads of the European nations, and they wouldn't be involved. So the fact that Kellogg is going to these European capitals to see what Europe thinks, at least the leading capitals. What does Macron think? What does Meloni think? And I hope he goes to Poland. I hope he goes to the UK, to the Nordics. There's other stops he could make, and I understand they're still putting together his itinerary. But the good news here is, number one, they are going for facts, and number two, it looks like they're asking European allies what their views are as well.
Yeah, and unless he goes to Budapest, he's likely to get a pretty unanimous set of opinions, isn't he, with regards to the support that Europe and the United States, it's felt, owes to Ukraine?
Well, that's an interesting question. He might go to Budapest just because of tipping the hat of the Trump administration's favor that they show to Budapest. So he might drop by there, and I guess he probably does need to hear from them. They've got a voice at NATO, certainly, and a vote at NATO. So, but I think your point about unity in Europe, about Ukraine, it's hard to say that there's a unified view. As you know, if you talk to Poles or Balts, Nordics, they're pretty hard over about Ukraine and no deal, and we got to win there. As you go further south, Italy, in Rome, he might hear something different in Rome than he might hear in Warsaw, for instance. So I think this fact finding probably will involve seeing what kind of unity there is there in Europe now. I mean, he'll probably need at some point to talk to the European Union. They are major players now in terms of finance, in terms of mobilizing a European defense industry. So he needs to stop in Brussels. But that might come later, at least in this initial visit. He's going to some European capitals to test the waters, and we'll see what he comes back with.
How much of a departure do you think we can expect from the Biden administration's approach to this war?
Well, that's interesting. I think certainly the initial impressions, based on what's been said, is it'll be quite a departure in that, the Biden administration continued to send large amounts of assistance to Ukraine. They weren't pressuring, at least publicly, they weren't pressuring Kyiv to make a deal. They weren't talking to Moscow or any Russian leaders at all. There's a whole different view about, and it was a long-term view about supporting Ukraine. With Trump, they've said no more assistance, or we'll give assistance only if we have to do that to drive Russia to the table. I mean, there's been a lot of ideas floated by various, I can't even call them officials, but various people in the Trump camp that talk about how assistance might be used as leverage. But we do know that the Republicans, there's a part of the Republican Party that wants to keep assistance going, but there's another part that does not. And so where the Trump team falls in that is probably split. And we'll have to just see in the weeks and months to come.
Okay, and just lastly, I mean, we've heard most recently from Donald Trump on the issue of Ukraine, him saying, gotta make a deal. That's with reference to discussions he intends to hold with both Presidents Zelensky and Putin. I mean, do you think the deal is inevitably going to involve Ukraine giving up large sections of its territory?
Well, it is difficult to say. I will give you my own personal impression is probably so. I don't know if it'll be large amounts of land. I don't know what kind of security guarantees will come with that, because I can't see Ukraine saying we'll give up the Donbas region and be left high and dry without NATO membership or any kind of security guarantees from the West. So it's all going to be part of these negotiations. But I think certainly on the table will be the land already occupied by Russia. Kursk might be on the table too in some ways. Ukrainian forces are still in Kursk, so it's going to be a difficult discussion. And Russia has a strong hand, unfortunately, in this. And Zelensky's hand that he's been dealt has been weakened by Trump saying, we're going to cut a deal, 24 hours, no assistance. So he's got his back to the wall, unfortunately.
OK, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Jim Townsend, thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.